Have you ever stopped to think about the truly strangest ways people have met their end? Not the usual things, accidents or illness, but the kind of deaths that are just so bizarre they almost sound made up. Well, today we're going to share 5 of history's most unusual, let's say peculiar demises. We actually pulled these from a really fascinating YouTube interview. One featuring a true crime storyteller and a medical expert gave us some really surprising angles. And our goal here for you listening is to sort of pull out the core insights from these really weird historical accounts. We'll bring in some medical, maybe even a bit of psychological analysis where we can, and just get you thinking about how unpredictable life really is. It's not just for shock value, right? It's more about understanding the body's limits and, well, fate's weird twists. Let's get into it. Okay, so we're kicking things off with death number 5. We're going back to 1771 AD to King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. Now, interestingly, he wasn't known for being a great ruler, kind of seen as a bit weak, actually. But strangely enough, that weakness meant Sweden had peace when everyone else was at war. So maybe not so bad. Anyway, this King Adolf, he had 2 main passions. One was collecting these really fancy snuff boxes, like beautifully made ones. He liked the art. But his other and much bigger passion, eating. Seriously, you could picture him today as like history's first food blogger or something, documenting every single meal. And yeah, it was this love of food that did him in. Picture this, February 12th, 1771, huge party, massive feast, lobster, caviar, kippers, all sorts of rich food. But then came dessert, his absolute favorite, the Semla bun. It's this sweet cardamom bun. And the really unbelievable part, according to the records, after that huge meal, he ate 14 servings of Semla with hot milk, 13.
Wow, 14 after a full feast. That's a lot.
Exactly. And just hours later, he collapsed. Couldn't breathe, lost consciousness, and then, well, that was it. Died. The old accounts get pretty dramatic, saying things like his organs flowed out or burst.
Yeah, that kind of detail, organs flowing out, it sounds, let's say, medically improbable. It's more likely historical exaggeration, or perhaps describing something like very severe bloody diarrhea, which would have looked horrific, but isn't quite the same as organs literally bursting. What, could someone actually die from eating too much? It's complicated. Hypothetically, if someone had a malfunctioning pyloric sphincter, that's the valve controlling food leaving the stomach, it might not signal fullness properly. If it stays too open, food passes too quickly, you don't feel full, you keep eating. This could lead to immense physical strain. Not necessarily the food itself killing you directly, but maybe triggering organ failure due to the sheer pressure, or perhaps a massive blood sugar spike. Back in the 18th century, they had no way to diagnose underlying issues, so something like that could definitely be fatal without anyone understanding why beyond he ate too much.
Right, so it's less about the food instantly killing him, more like the extreme volume pushed his system past its breaking point, maybe exploiting an unknown weakness. It really makes you think about moderation, even for kings. Okay, so from a king undone by food, let's shift gears completely. Death number 4 takes us way back 280 BC. This time it's a philosopher, Chrysippus, a famous stoic, the kind who taught that virtue is everything, appearances don't matter. Very serious guy, supposedly. But Chrysippus apparently had this sort of double life. Serious philosopher by day, sure, but at night, reports say he was a pretty heavy drinker, loved a good party, and get this, he had a pet donkey. And apparently he used to take this donkey with him to parties. I mean, can you imagine?
A party donkey? That's angry.
Right. So the story goes, one night, Chrysippus is drunk, and he decides it's a good idea to give his donkey some wine. The donkey gets drunk, naturally. Then Chrysippus finds this even funnier and offers the drunk donkey figs, which apparently donkeys don't usually eat. The donkey trying to eat the figs, probably stumbling around drunk, just looked so bizarre that Chrysippus started laughing, and he couldn't stop. He laughed and laughed and laughed, apparently so hard he couldn't catch his breath and just died right there from laughing too much.
Laughing himself to death. It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? But medically, while it's incredibly rare, extreme prolonged laughter can potentially cause problems. Think about it, if you're laughing uncontrollably, you can hyperventilate. If you're not exhaling properly, you can retain too much carbon dioxide, your oxygen levels drop. It could lead to respiratory distress, maybe even collapse or asphyxiation, a very extreme, very unusual case. We've all had that feeling of laughing so hard we can't breathe, right? This is just the fatal version. Now, the really strange detail in some accounts is about broken ribs found during an autopsy. That part. Almost certainly not true. Ribs are strong. You don't break ribs from laughing, no matter how hard. That sounds like historical storytelling, adding a bit of dramatic flair.
So the likely cause wasn't his ribs exploding from joy, but more like his respiratory system just failing under the strain of nonstop laughter. That actually makes a strange kind of sense.
Wow. Even joy can be too much, apparently. All right, let's move forward in time again to the Viking era, around 875 AD. Death number 3. Sigurd the Mighty. He was a big deal, a powerful Viking chieftain ruling northern Scotland. And he had this reputation for never losing a battle. He was also known for, let's say, creative tactics. Some called it strategy, others definitely called it cheating. He seemed pretty focused on winning, not necessarily playing fair. So there's this battle against a Scottish warlord named Malbrigte. Sigurd proposed they each bring 40 men. Fair enough, right? So Malbrigte, she shows up with this 40 guys on foot. But Sigurd arrives with 40 horses, each carrying 2 warriors. So 80 men against 40. Not exactly an even match. They won easily, of course.
A bit deceptive, yeah. Classic battlefield trickery. Totally. And after the battle, Sigurd did the typical Viking thing, beheaded his enemies. He took Malbrigte's head as a trophy, tied it to his saddle to show off on the ride home. Now here's the absolutely unbelievable twist. Malbrigte was apparently known as Bucktooth. As Sigurd rode, the severed head, bouncing against his leg, somehow managed to, bite him. The bucktooth grazed an existing cut or wound on Sigurd's ankle.
Wait, the severed head bit him? Just from bouncing?
That's the story. A posthumous bite from a trophy head. And that small wound got infected. Badly infected. And this is 875 AD, remember. No antibiotics. So Sigurd the Mighty, undefeated warrior, died. Not from a sword, but from an infected bite wound caused by his dead enemy's tooth scraping his ankle.
That is extraordinarily bad luck. Just astronomical odds. Medically speaking, though, it's grimly plausible. The human mouth is full of bacteria. Even a scrape from a tooth, especially breaking the skin on an existing wound, could introduce a really nasty infection. Without any way to treat it back then, something like that could easily lead to sepsis, a massive body-wide infection. And sepsis was very often fatal. It's a shocking story, but the medical consequence, the fatal infection from a contaminated wound, makes horrifying sense for the time.
It's just incredible. The ultimate irony, right? A warrior famed for victory taken down by such a bizarre random event after the battle was already won really speaks to life's unpredictability. Okay, moving on to number 2. We're back in ancient Greece, around 250 BC. This is Aristus. He was apparently a very persuasive philosopher, led his own sect, sometimes called the father of heresy, also known for being a skilled negotiator, even in politics. So the scene is, Aristus is right in the middle of a really intense political debate, high stakes, lots of important people around. He's trying to hold his own, maintain his image, and then he suddenly gets that, urgent feeling, needs to pass gas, maybe more, but he's in this formal setting, wants to keep his dignity, his status, so he decides to hold it in. Really strained to keep it all contained, and the reported outcome collapsed, died right there. The historical accounts claim things like his insides failed or even ruptured from the pressure he was exerting.
Okay, this one is medically very unusual. Dying directly from holding in gas. Extremely unlikely. Your body has sphincters, mechanisms designed to release pressure eventually, whether you want to or not. It's hard to imagine someone literally rupturing their insides just from holding back gas. However, could the intense straining have contributed indirectly? Possibly. If he had a pre-existing undiagnosed condition, maybe a weak spot in his bowel, an aneurysm, a heart condition, the immense strain of holding everything in could, hypothetically, trigger a catastrophic event. For instance, a bowel perforation, a tear leading to peritonitis, a severe abdominal infection is life-threatening. Or maybe the strain triggered a heart attack or stroke. A more medically recognized severe condition is fecal impaction, basically extreme constipation where hardened stool blocks the bowel. That can cause obstructions and potentially rupture if untreated, and it is incredibly painful and dangerous. I've dealt with patients with severe bowel obstructions, and the pressure and risk are very real. So, while maybe not a fart explosion, the act of intense internal straining isn't entirely without risk, especially if something else is already wrong.
So the lesson isn't don't hold it in or you'll explode, but more that suppressing basic bodily functions so violently could, in rare cases, push an already compromised system over the edge. It's a bizarre link between social pressure and fatal physiology. All right, that brings us to our number 1 most bizarre death, and this one is truly legendary. Grigory Rasputin, early 20th century Russia. His nickname alone, Rasputin, basically means debauched one. He became famous or infamous for his sort of mystical persona, his persuasive power, and some really controversial teachings. He even had this weird idea that marathon sexual activity could purify the soul.
Yeah.
Always a controversy. Definitely. His reputation as a healer, though, got him noticed by the Romanovs, the Russian royal family. Specifically, he seemed to help Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the throne, who had hemophilia, a bleeding disorder. Rasputin apparently managed to stop the bleeding during severe episodes when doctors couldn't. This gave him incredible influence, especially with the Tsarina. But this power, plus his scandalous lifestyle, the drinking, the womanizing, made a lot of Russian nobles furious. They saw him as a dangerous influence, manipulating the royals. So, a group of them, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, plotted to kill him. It's one of history's most famous assassination attempts. First, they tried poison. They gave him cakes and wine laced with cyanide, enough to kill several men, supposedly. Rasputin ate and drank it, and nothing happened. He just carried on, maybe complained the wine was a bit bitter. His assassins were stunned.
Still debated why the poison failed. Wrong dose? Maybe something neutralized it? Or just Rasputin's strange constitution?
Who knows? So, plan B, Yusupov pulled out a gun and shot him at close range. Rasputin fell. But then, as Yusupov checked on him, Rasputin apparently leaped up, roaring, and attacked the prince.
That sounds like pure adrenaline. The fight-or-flight response can produce incredible bursts of strength, even when severely injured.
Absolutely. The other conspirators rushed in, shot him several more times, including supposedly one to the head. Then they beat him savagely. He finally collapsed. They even got a doctor to check him, who declared him dead. But they weren't taking chances. They wrapped up the body, drove to the frozen Neva River, cut a hole in the ice, and dumped him in. End of story, right?
You'd think so, after all that.
Nope. When they recovered his body later and did an autopsy, the official cause of death was listed as drowning.
Drowning. After poison, multiple gunshots, including a headshot, and a beating.
Exactly. It means he was somehow still alive when they threw him into that freezing river. He survived everything else, only to finally succumb to the icy water and suffocation.
That is just astounding resilience.
Yeah.
Medically, it pushes the boundaries of belief. The initial survival could be adrenaline, maybe non-fatal wound placements despite the number of shots, maybe the poison wasn't as effective as thought, but to still be alive enough to drown after all that, it suggests an incredible physiological tenacity. Maybe the extreme cold even slowed his bleeding or metabolism temporarily, the physiological freezing idea, but ultimately, the drowning shows he was alive when he hit the water. Of course, we also have to remember that accounts of his death are famously conflicting, often embellished. The legend might be even stranger than the reality, whatever that truly was.
It's just an unbelievable story. It really speaks to the limits of the human body, how much it can sometimes endure, and also how history itself gets shaped and retold. Rasputin's death is almost as mysterious as his life. So there you have it. 5 incredibly strange ways to go. King Adolf Frederick eating himself to death, Chrysippus laughing his last breath, Sigurd the Mighty felled by a dead man's tooth, Aristus undone by holding it in, and Rasputin, well, just refusing to die until he was drowned. You know, exploring these stories, they're more than just weird historical footnotes. They're really stark reminders of how fragile life can be, but also how utterly unpredictable the circumstances of our end might be. We know our birth date, but never the date or the bizarre manner of our departure.
That's absolutely right. These tales, as bizarre as they are, they do offer a kind of lesson. Maybe about mindfulness, about not taking basic health or safety for granted. They make you appreciate the sheer complexity of our bodies and just how many strange turns a life can take. Maybe as you go about your day-to-day, just think for a moment about that strange link between cause and effect. How sometimes the most unexpected, almost trivial things can lead to the most final of outcomes. What tiny, unseen events might be nudging your own life path in ways you'd never guess.
We really hope digging into these peculiar histories has left you not just maybe a little spooked, but also more curious about all the weird and wonderful layers of history and the human experience. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.